This week, I'm starting my series on Azure and the enterprise. We'll be going through a standard Azure subscription and showing you how to change it to apply topology to it by adding hierarchy via management groups. And we'll be taking you through and talking about how one might partition their environment in these scenarios. We'll also be using some parts of the Azure governance stack to apply changes to and to create things and even constrain the creation of resources. There we will be using Azure blueprints, Azure policy, and basic RBACs or role-based access control to enable these capabilities. Setting up this kind of structure is actually very common in enterprise deployments of Azure. In those scenarios, it's really all about how quickly and easily one can deploy applications to the cloud or create landing zones for users to leverage cloud-based functionality. We'll talk about all those features later and in later chapters in this series. For now, we'll start our lecture by exploring Azure Resource Manager templates. ARM templates, as they're called, are basically a resource definition language conceptually modeled after desired state configuration of your system. This means that in lay terms, that you declaratively say how you want your system to look. Then you run a program that takes your definition and actually creates the environment you defined. You can think of these definition files, the ARM templates themselves, as infrastructure as code, because you can store these anywhere, just like code files, and manage the versioning of these files like you would any C#, Java, or C++ file, all in a source control repository. So let's jump right in and see what ARM templates look like and how they work. Now, mind you, this is not meant to be a comprehensive look at the technology. It's more like a high-level overview and showing you the main capabilities of the technology that you need when doing your day-to-day tasks working in the enterprise. All right, so now that we've set the parameters, let's get into what we need to do for this exercise. So to get this going, you will need a console of some kind. I am using Windows PowerShell on Windows Terminal, right? So that's the product that I'm using, and I'm actually going to switch that over to PowerShell itself. Okay, let's see if I have all the AZ. Well, I'll get into that later, but let's start with using PowerShell. Okay, and you're gonna need Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. For this exercise, I'm gonna be using Visual Studio Code, but you can do this with Visual Studio as well. And you're gonna need the Azure AZ module, basically, right? So to get the easiest way to check to see if you have the AZ model is to try to create, try to run a command that won't work otherwise. So I'm gonna do new AZ. Okay, so resource group. Okay, so we have all the AZ commands right now, and there is a way to check the version, but I'm not going to do that right now. Okay, so we have that. The next thing that we're going to want to do is open up our Visual Studio Code. So I have that open right here, and I already have a project set up. You're gonna have, or a folder where I'm gonna be working in. So I'm gonna make sure that I have terminal running here. I'm gonna do a CLS. Okay, and then I'm going to go over to extensions, and I want to make sure that under extensions I have the extension for Azure, for the stuff I'm going to be doing with Azure Resource Manager. Okay, and it's the Azure Resource Manager tool. So Azure Resource, so ARM tools right here, and you basically just need to install that. And once you install that, you will have IntelliSense for Azure, for code snippets and everything. You'll be able to work with ARM templates. I would also go ahead and get rid of that. I would also look at what's installed. So I obviously got .NET, I have ARM, and then you see over here I also have PowerShell, right? So this at least makes it a little bit easier for you when it's time to start running your shell scripts and doing everything. At least you know with PowerShell, it opens everything all up in one view, one window, and you can work from there. Okay. So getting into ARM templates, let's go ahead and let's open up this file called ARM1. So ARM templates are written in JSON. The whole thing is JSON. There's no other language. It's just the format of the JSON, the kinds of the kinds of fields that need to be filled out and populated, kinds of objects that are out there that changes whether or not it's something that will work as an ARM template or something that will not work as an ARM. So let's go ahead and let's get started with building our ARM template that we're going to be using for this, using to learn. So to get going, there's some key components to the templates that you actually have to have. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just basically create a very basic template. So let's copy it here, and okay, so here are the sections. So if you take a look at this, you have your schema, you have your current version, you have parameters, variables, resources, and outputs. Okay, now this version of this document right now is an older version of the document. There's actually a newer version of this document, and it is for 2019. Right? And this guy actually adds new capabilities, new things that you can create. But let's just demo this ARM template right now. And the way that you actually run the template is you have to do what's called a new Azure resource deployment. So let's do it here, new AZ resource group deployment. Here we go. And then we need our resource group name. So over here in Azure, in our resource groups, I've created a resource group in my demo subscription, and in a later video I'll show you how to do the subscriptions and management groups and all that. But I've created a resource group here just called RG1, and that's what we're going to be using for what we're doing here. So my resource group name is going to be RG1, and my template file, right? Template file itself, not a parameter file. Template file is going to be this file that I'm using, which is arm1.json. I'm going to run that. There you go. And that should bring you back just a basic standard result. So why is it bringing back a basic standard result? It's bringing that back because, as you can see, the ARM template doesn't do anything. So whatever is passed in is passed out. I passed in RG1, it's passed out. The deployment name was ARM1. That was the name of this file. So it's passed. So that's what's passed out. So I don't want to set it up like that. So I'm actually going to take this and I'm going to take this whole thing right here and I'm going to put it into a PowerShell so that I can just run the PowerShell. And then over here, I'm going to do the same thing and just see if it works. So now I can just do run.ps1 and I should get the same results. Perfect. So far so good. So the first thing you should know is what are the components of the ARM template. You have the schema, the content, parameters, variables, resources, and outputs, and I'll explain all of that as we go on, right? But one thing to note actually is that this is not the most bare bones that this can get. It can actually get even smaller. Pretty much the only things that's mandatory, is the schema, obviously, the content version, obviously, and the resources, right? So if you're not planning to have any outputs, you don't need the outputs. If you don't have any variables, you don't need the variables. If you don't have any parameters, you don't need the parameters. And this is the smallest unit that will work for deploying an ARM template, even though it obviously will not deploy. So let's run this because there's no resources in it, right? All right, so we now have the small version and we just ran it. Let's run it again. And as you can see, it's basically doing what it used to do. So let's go ahead and let's add back all the fields that we took out because they all have a purpose, and I'm going to go through each one of the purposes. So what is the point of the parameters? Well, the parameters, as with most programs, the parameters basically allow you to take input into the program. So whatever you have defined as a parameter is something that you can pass into the program. Let's test this out. So I'm going to create a new parameter. I'm going to call it age. Okay. Owner age. And so for parameters, because they're parameters, you're going to have to define a type associated with it, right? So what's the type? It's going to be an integer, and you can optionally decide whether or not you want it to have a default value, right? So there's two other things that parameters can have. They can have a default value. When you provide a default value, it'll just use the default value. So right now, if I save this and I run it, it's asking me to supply owner age. So let's say 22, and then it's going to run through, do nothing, and be done with it, right? But if I supply a default age, default value, let's say 25, then when I run this, it'll use the 25. So now that we've set the owner age and we have it as a parameter, there's a couple of ways that we can access it. Obviously, we've sort of modified our code right now so that it just calls the actual template using the new Azure Resource Group deployment. So if I were to just run this, run.ps1, oopsie, forgot to remove the default value here, just to show how that works. So you can see it'll work normally, it'll take that default value, but I want to kind of show you, yeah, there you go. So you have to pick the owner age when it runs. So 43, and now it's going to use 43 because there's no default value, right? But what if you want to keep the default value, but you want to pass owner that value in as part of the command line? Well, there's a couple of things you can do. We can actually go here, and as you can see, I can just append it, right? So go back here and I'm going to make this 25. So by default, if I run this, my result will be 25. But if I add that parameter, just manually add it here, owner age, hit enter. Wait, oopsie. Give it a 67. And it's going to tell you what was passed in 67. So it's basically using the value that I've passed in. So how do you resolve this sort of thing? Because obviously we're not directly using this command. So one thing we can do is we can add a parameter directly here. Okay, so just using the normal PowerShell scripting. Let's call it worker age, resource age, and then over here I'm going to do owner age, and then I'm going to pass in the resource age. Okay, so what I'm doing is I've now created another parameter called resource age that I'm basically passing into my call to AZ resource group deployment. So when I go here, I don't need to do all this. I can just do run ps1. That's gonna fail. Why is it failing? Because I haven't passed the parameter, and so it's taking owner age is going as null. So let's pass that parameter, minus resource age, and then we'll pass 99. And there you have it, 99 is being passed in. The other cool thing you can work with is variables. So you can think of parameters as that's what's coming into your system, your ARM template, your script. But obviously it's coming in from where? It's coming in from the user, right? And so the names that you use, owner age, right, might need to be more useful. Actually, I'm going to change that to resource age. So because of that, I'm also going to change that to resource age. There you go. So resource age might be what you have there, but that might not be a name that you want necessarily exposed to the to your internal program. That's probably something you want for external processing. So variables allow you to give internal names to those parameters to store them internally, and then they also allow you to manipulate them some way. It's basically a write once, read everywhere style of values that can have that basically you can use the label, the name of it, all through your ARM template to do different things, right? So go ahead, and so we have the resource age, and let's go ahead and let's create something else called resource name, and that's going to be a type of string, and that is going to have a max value of 50, let's just say. Okay, and then of course we put the comma there. Main value, max length. Let's go ahead and let's change this. Made a mistake here. Max length is what I wanted. That should be 50. There you go. Okay, so I now have a resource name that I have to provide and a resource age that will be 0 by default. But if you pass in a year, it'll use it. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to give an internal name to this that basically puts these two things together. So I'm going to call it moniker. Okay, and it's going to reference both of these items, right? So how do you reference a parameter that's in the parameters? Well, you sort of look at it as a function that pulls out the parameter value based on the key that you provided, so resource name or resource age. So you call one of these functions, it's called parameters, and then in that function you pass in what you want to pull in. So in this case I want to take resource name. Okay, now for functions to work you have to enclose them in square brackets, right? So this is just a convention for pretty much any kind of scripting. Everything is going to be taken as text. Anything that needs any kind of dynamic work, that's a value, so it's inside of a string, it's a JSON value, you have to put inside of the square brackets. And when you put them inside the square brackets and properly spell, they show up, right? So my resource moniker is now my resource name, but I don't just want it to be my resource name, right? I also want it to incorporate the age of the resource. So how can I do that? Well, there are some built-in functions that are in ARM that you can use to do just that. And one of them is called concat, right? So string concatenation. So concat, if we look at it, it takes multiple arguments and it just combines them together. So similar to the concat that exists in a million different places. So what are the two arguments that we're taking? The first one is the parameter resource name. The other one is a dash. And the third one will be a parameters resource age. There we go. Okay. So what am I doing? I've now created a variable that basically concatenates the resource name and the resource age and puts a hyphen between them. right? So again, you start to see the value that comes with this, because again, if you were to copy this whole thing and paste it everywhere, if you needed to make a change to it, you'd have to go and make a change everywhere. In this case, I just come to resource moniker and I change the configuration of resource moniker, and once I change that, it changes everywhere. So let's run this. It should run fine. It's still not going to produce any results. I do need to have the resource name, don't I? So resource name is John Smith. Okay, so let's go through. And there we go. We pass in John Smith and 99. So now let's look at the third thing that we see here. All the way at the bottom, we're going to skip resources for now, and it's called outputs. Now, what are outputs? Outputs, basically, you can think of as, if you're a C# programmer, it's basically console.writeLine. That's essentially it. You can output any values that are within the scope of your template, and it will print those values out into the console or whatever is reading those values. So let's use that, and let's now print out what I've created here, right? So I've created something that should be resource name concatenated with a dash resource age. So let's see if we got it right. Okay, so how do you create outputs? Well, you go in here and you simply start adding your output. It's going to be an object, and every property in the object is going to be presented out. Okay, so I'll create one property called baseline, and the property baseline is essentially going to have a type of string, and it's going to have a value of okay, so this is going to be what's printed out, this baseline. But that's not all I'm going to do. I'm going to actually create another output, because you can have more than one. And this time I'm going to call it moniker. Moniker used. Okay, and in here I am not going to pass a static field. I'm going to pass a dynamic field that's reading from the variables, just like parameters. And you pass in the variable name, so in this case resource moniker, and you get your results back. So there you have it. CLS. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's run this. Okay, so resource age would be 22. Resource name is Joe Johnson. There you go. So now for your output, you see we have baseline. It's called baseline printing, and the moniker used, it has the value says Joe Johnson -22, because we passed in 22 and we passed in Joe Johnson, right? So these are the very, very simple basics of ARM templates. This is the stuff you actually need to know before you can even get into the other stuff. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about creating your own custom functions, and then we're going to actually start adding resources, and we're actually going to deploy to the cloud. As always, if you like this content and you like these videos, like and subscribe, and have a blessed and pleasant day. Thank you.